The South China Sea is one of the most contested bodies of water on Earth. It's bordered by 6 countries, claimed by several more, and it carries nearly 1/3 of the world's maritime trade. But today, it's more than just a shipping lane. Military bases now rise from artificial islands, patrols by warships are routine, and a single spark, a downed drone, a seized vessel, could ignite a regional war. It feels like a modern crisis, but its roots are buried deep in history. To understand this conflict, we have to go back to colonial-era treaties, back to vanished empires, and back to the lines drawn on maps, often by people who never lived there. This isn't just a story about oil or islands or shipping routes. It's a story about how history shaped the present and why the future of Asia could depend on what happens next. This is the full story of the South China Sea. Before we can understand the tensions in the South China Sea, we need to understand the sea itself, where it lies, what surrounds it, and why this patch of ocean has drawn the attention of world powers for over a century. Chapter 1: Colonial Shadows and Broken Maps. Before radar, oil tankers, or patrol boats, these waters were something quieter, a fluid highway of fishing boats and monsoon winds, a world navigated by memory, trade routes, and tide charts, not by borders. The islands scattered across the sea were charted by sailors and known by names passed down through generations. There were no lines, no fences, no sovereignty disputes, just storms, reefs, and stories. That changed in the 19th century. As European empires expanded across Asia, they began carving up the land and ignoring the sea. The British took control of Malaya, Singapore, and northern Borneo. The French seized Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, forming what became known as French Indochina. Their focus was land, not water, and the maps they left behind reflected that. Territorial boundaries were drawn with rulers and ink, but the sea was often left blank. The Spratly and Paracel Islands, the 2 main archipelagos at the center of today's conflict, were rarely even labeled. When they were, it was often imprecise, based on poor charts, or entirely symbolic. And yet those vague colonial records are now the foundation of modern territorial claims. Things changed again in the early 20th century, when oil became the engine of empire. Japan, resource-hungry and increasingly aggressive, began surveying islands across the South China Sea. In the 1930s, it moved into the Paracels, sparking concern from the French in Vietnam. To counter Japan's advance, the French laid claim to several islands in 1933, sending warships to the Spratlys and establishing a garrison. Japan pushed back in 1939, formally annexing the Paracels and Spratlys in the lead-up to World War II. By 1941, Japan controlled the sea and would do so until the end of the war. Then came surrender, and with it, a new wave of confusion. In the 1943 Cairo Declaration, the Allied powers declared that Japan must return all territories it had taken from Chitanko. This was echoed again in the 1945 Potsdam Declaration and formalized in the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951, where Japan renounced its claims to the Spratly and Paracel Islands entirely. But here's the catch. That treaty never said who those islands should go to. There was no official transfer of sovereignty, no map, no names, just absence. Into that vacuum stepped the Republic of China, ROC, then still in control of the mainland. In 1947, the ROC released a map that drew a sweeping U-shaped line across nearly the entire South China Sea, made up of 11 dashes. It was the first modern assertion of a full sea claim, and it had no legal precedent, but it stuck. 2 years later, the ROC lost the Chinese Civil War. The People's Republic of China, PRC, took control of the mainland, while the ROC fled to Taiwan. But both governments, even today, continue to claim that 1947 map as the basis for their rights in the South China Sea. Meanwhile, Europe's empires were collapsing. The British withdrew from Malaya and North Borneo. The French lost Vietnam after the First Indochina War, and newly independent countries, the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei, inherited borders drawn by someone else. In some cases, they inherited no maritime borders at all. The Philippines, for instance, became independent in 1946 under the terms of the 1898 Treaty of Paris, when the United States acquired the archipelago from Spain. But the treaty only referenced land boundaries. The sea was undefined. Later, the Philippines would point to Spanish-era maps from the 1800s to justify its claims to the Kalayaan Island Group, a cluster within the Spratlys. But again, these were colonial records, never intended to draw international lines. Vietnam inherited overlapping claims from both the French colonial archives and the South Vietnamese government, which published its own claims in the 1950s. Malaysia based its rights on its continental shelf, but even those maps were grounded in British charts, and Brunei's claim is tied entirely to its exclusive economic zone under UNCLOS, which itself conflicts with China's 9-dash line. In short, every country in the region is using a different version of history, different maps, different treaties, different ideas of who was there first, and who should be there now. This legal patchwork was made worse in the 1970s when oil exploration intensified. Suddenly, the Spratlys and Paracels weren't just symbols, they were energy reserves. And when the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, was adopted in 1982, it allowed countries to claim maritime rights 200 nautical miles from their shores. But it didn't, and couldn't, resolve the deeper issue. Who owns the islands themselves? Because the claims weren't born from UNCLOS. They were born from colonial maps, wartime ambiguity, and post-war silence. Today, China cites its 1947 map. Vietnam references French records from the 1930s. The Philippines looks to Spanish-era maps and post-war administrative acts. These claims are rooted in different versions of history, often incomplete, often contradictory, and rarely aligned with international law. The problem is not simply who claims what, it's that the legal foundations themselves were never clearly defined. Colonial maps were created for control, not consensus, and when the empires withdrew, they left behind borders that were vague, overlapping, or entirely absent. This lack of clarity is why disputes continue today. The sea's geography hasn't changed, but the meaning of its islands, and the ambitions tied to them, have evolved dramatically. In the next chapter, we'll see how those colonial legacies were reshaped by a new global conflict, the Cold War. Chapter 2. The Cold War and Shifting Control. The end of World War II left much of Southeast Asia in transition. European powers were withdrawing, Japan's empire was dismantled, and new countries were being formed in the vacuum. But that vacuum didn't last long. As the Cold War began, the South China Sea became more than a question of history or law. It became a question of ideology. And once again, outside powers took an interest. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War ended in a split. The People's Republic of China took control of the mainland. The defeated Republic of China, or ROC, retreated to the island of Taiwan. Both governments claimed to represent all of China, and both insisted that their maritime boundaries, including the Spratly and Paracel Islands, were valid. In the early 1950s, the newly formed People's Republic of China began to reassert its presence. It sent patrols into the South China Sea, raised flags on unoccupied rocks, and challenged nearby nations that had inherited colonial-era claims. At the same time, conflict in Vietnam was escalating. By 1954, France had been defeated at Dien Bien Phu, and the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam into North and South. The United States quickly moved in to support the South as a bulwark against communism. Vietnam's coastline, stretching over 3,000 kilometers, became a key strategic zone, and so did the islands offshore. Both North and South Vietnam claimed the Paracels and parts of the Spratlys, but it was South Vietnam, backed by the U.S., that actively occupied several features in the 1950s and 60s. Meanwhile, the Philippines, a formal U.S. ally since its independence in 1946, began to strengthen its interest in the Kalayaan Island Group, a section of the Spratlys it would claim in the 1970s. Malaysia became independent in 1957, and would later stake a claim based on its continental shelf. Each of these countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan, held overlapping claims, but none had the military capability to enforce them fully. That changed with the rise of naval power in the region, especially China's. In 1974, China made its most decisive move yet. At the time, the Paracel Islands were partly occupied by South Vietnam, but after a brief naval battle, China seized full control of the island group, sinking several Vietnamese ships and killing dozens. It was a turning point. For the first time, China had used direct military force to assert its maritime claim. The United States, then heavily focused on the final stages of its withdrawal from Vietnam, did not intervene. From that point onward, China maintained de facto control of the Paracels. Vietnam, both South and later unified, continued to claim them, but never regained access. In the 1980s, attention shifted to the Spratly Islands. The Spratlys are far more scattered, difficult to access, and legally ambiguous. Control was fragmented. Vietnam held many features, the Philippines had a few, Malaysia occupied several reefs, but China wanted a foothold there too. In 1988, Chinese and Vietnamese forces clashed at Johnson South Reef. Chinese troops landed on the reef, and Vietnamese sailors, many of them unarmed, tried to stop them. Chinese gunboats opened fire. At least 64 Vietnamese personnel were killed. China took the reef and began building a structure. It was the first of several. This incident, almost unknown outside the region, marked the beginning of China's modern military presence in the Spratlys. Throughout the 1990s, China expanded its reach. While Vietnam and the Philippines continued to patrol nearby areas, they lacked the resources to match China's growing fleet. China was now entering a phase of rapid economic growth, and it began investing heavily in its navy. The Cold War was officially over by 1991, but the strategic logic remained. With the United States still deeply involved in Asia, through treaties with the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea, China saw the South China Sea as an area where it could test its regional influence. Each new feature it occupied allowed it to project surveillance, air power, and maritime control farther from its coast. Each artificial structure laid the groundwork for the transformation that would come in the 2000s. But it's important to understand, the Cold War didn't create the South China Sea dispute. What it did was intensify it, militarize it, and turn small reefs into symbols of national prestige and global rivalry. By the 1990s, the South China Sea was no longer a forgotten corner of colonial history. It was an emerging front in a post-colonial, post-Cold War power struggle, one that hadn't yet reached its peak. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the legal rules were rewritten and why the South China Sea's most famous map was never recognized by international law. Chapter 3. Drawing Lines and Ignoring Rules. By the 1990s, the South China Sea was crowded with claims. Vietnam controlled dozens of small reefs and islets. The Philippines manned scattered outposts. Malaysia and Brunei made resource-based claims, and China had begun its modern naval buildup. But as tensions rose, one question grew louder. Where exactly does China claim? The answer, at least officially, lies in a map first published in 1947 by the Republic of China. It featured a U-shaped maritime boundary made up of 11 dashes, looping from China's southern coast deep into the South China Sea. After the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the map was reissued, this time with 9 dashes, hence the name, the 9-dash line. This line curves past Vietnam's coast, past the Philippines, around Malaysia, and just off the shores of Borneo. It encloses nearly 90% of the entire South China Sea, but what exactly it means, and where exactly it starts and ends, has never been clearly defined. China refers to it as a boundary of historic rights, but what those rights include, territorial, sovereignty, fishing, oil exploration, remains vague by design. Here's the problem. In 1982, the international community adopted the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. It's a treaty signed by more than 160 countries, including China. It created a framework for defining maritime rights and zones, including territorial seas, up to 12 nautical miles from a country's coast, exclusive economic zones, EEZs, up to 200 nautical miles, where a country controls resources like fish, oil, and gas. Under UNCLOS, islands that can support human life get an EEZ. Rocks and submerged features do not. This makes the South China Sea complicated. Most of the features in the Spratlys and Paracels are small. Many are submerged at high tide or just exposed rocks. According to UNCLOS, these features can't generate EEZs. They don't qualify as territory in the legal sense. And yet China, along with several other claimants, has continued to build installations on these features and treat them as extensions of sovereign land. In 2013, the Philippines brought a legal case to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, challenging the 9-line under UNCLOS. The Philippines argued that China's claim had no legal basis. Several of China's occupied reefs were not islands and therefore could not generate EEZs. China had violated international law by interfering with Filipino fishermen and oil exploration. China refused to participate in the proceedings. It called the court illegitimate and insisted on bilateral negotiations instead. But the case went forward anyway. In July 2016, the tribunal issued a landmark ruling. The verdict was sweeping. China's 9-line was found to have no legal basis under international law. None of the Spratly features China occupies qualify as full islands. China had violated the Philippines' sovereign rights within its exclusive economic zone, and China's large-scale island-building projects had caused irreparable harm to the marine environment. The ruling was seen as a major victory for the Philippines and for the idea of a rules-based order in Asia. But China rejected the decision entirely. It claimed the ruling was null and void and has continued to enforce its claims using Coast Guard patrols, fishing fleets, and military presence. The United States, while not a party to UNCLOS itself, has supported the ruling and regularly conducts freedom of navigation operations in the area to challenge what it sees as excessive Chinese claims. Other ASEAN countries, while not taking formal legal action, have quietly welcomed the ruling, but remain wary of pushing too far against China's economic and military weight. Since 2016, the situation has remained frozen. China refuses to recognize the court's authority. The Philippines, under successive administrations, has alternated between confrontation and diplomacy. Other claimants, like Vietnam and Malaysia, monitor developments cautiously. And the South China Sea remains a legal gray zone, where court rulings exist, but enforcement is minimal. It's not that the law is unclear. United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea defines maritime zones. The tribunal interpreted those rules and applied them, but without enforcement, without mutual agreement, law becomes suggestion, and that's the core problem. China believes its history grants it exceptional rights. International law says otherwise, and neither side is willing to back down. The result is a long-term stalemate, where ships pass under surveillance, where fishermen are harassed, where maps don't match reality, and where the law, even when clear, has no anchor. In the next chapter, we'll leave the courtroom and return to the sea, as China builds islands, installs weapons, and turns legal claims into physical control. Chapter 4. Turning reefs into runways. In recent years, the focus has shifted from who owns what to who controls what, and that control is increasingly visible. Between 2013 and 2017, China carried out a massive land reclamation program across the Spratly Islands. It began with remote reefs, submerged or barely above sea level, and transformed them into fortified outposts. Satellite images show the scale. Fiery Cross Reef now hosts a 3,000-meter runway, radar domes, hangars, and anti-aircraft systems. Subi Reef and Mischief Reef have similar runways, deep water harbors, and hardened shelters. Smaller reefs, like Gavin, Johnson South, and Quarteron, have been equipped with surveillance gear and missile platforms. Altogether, China has built over 3,200 acres of new land in the Spratlys, and these aren't civilian installations, they are military bases. In 2016, U.S. Pacific Command stated that China had installed HQ-9 surface-to-air missile systems on Woody Island in the Paracels, over 300 kilometers from the mainland. Later, YJ-12 anti-ship cruise missiles were spotted on Fiery Cross. These moves changed the balance of power. China now maintains constant maritime patrols through its People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia, a fleet of fishing vessels that can quickly coordinate with the Navy and Coast Guard. These vessels don't just monitor, they engage in blocking maneuvers, intimidation, and harassment, especially near disputed areas like Second Thomas Shoal and Scarborough Shoal. Let's take a more detailed look at these two recent flashpoints. First, Scarborough Shoal. It's located just 220 kilometers from Luzon, in the Philippines, and is a key fishing ground and a flashpoint. In 2012, Chinese vessels blocked Filipino fishermen, triggering a 2-month standoff. Eventually, the U.S. brokered a mutual withdrawal agreement. The Philippines pulled out. China did not. Since then, China has maintained control, using rotating Coast Guard and militia vessels to enforce de facto authority. In 2023, the Philippines released footage showing floating barriers installed by Chinese forces to block access. Divers from the Philippine Coast Guard later removed part of the barrier. So now we move on to the Second Thomas Shoal. This submerged reef lies inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, but it's also within China's 9-dash line. To reinforce its claim, the Philippine Navy grounded a World War II-era ship, the BRP Sierra Madre, on the reef in 1999. It has remained there ever since, rusting and listing, manned by a rotating crew of Marines. In August 2023, Chinese Coast Guard vessels fired water cannons at Philippine supply boats attempting to reach the ship. The footage went viral. International condemnation followed. China defended the action, calling it professional and restrained. As for the United States, it does not take sides in territorial claims, but it challenges what it sees as excessive claims. Under international law, warships have the right of innocent passage through EEZs and international waters, so the U.S. Navy routinely sails near disputed features, particularly those occupied by China, to assert that these are not sovereign waters. In 2023, the USS Milius conducted multiple transits near Mischief Reef and Paracel-claimed waters. China labeled these actions provocations and sent naval escorts in response. Both sides conduct these operations regularly, and they're carefully managed to avoid escalation. But the risk is always present. One miscommunication, one overcorrection, one accident, and the standoff could turn into a crisis. The problem today isn't just about claims, it's about facts on the water. China controls all of the paracels China occupies and has militarized at least 7 major features in the Spratlys. Vietnam controls around 29 features. The Philippines holds 9 outposts, including Sierra Madre, Malaysia, and Taiwan, maintain smaller but real presences. The question is no longer who claims what. It's who can sustain it and who can stop it. Diplomatic efforts have stalled. In 2002, ASEAN and China signed a Declaration of Conduct, a promise to resolve disputes peacefully and avoid militarization. But over 20 years later, there's still no binding code of conduct. Negotiations continue, but trust remains low. In the meantime, fishing boats are harassed, survey ships are blocked, and aircraft are warned off with increasing regularity. Each incident may seem minor, but each adds pressure. The standoff is no longer theoretical, it's happening in slow motion, every day, at sea. In the next chapter, we'll look at what the future could hold, from climate change and deep-sea drilling to US-China rivalry and the possibility of armed conflict. We'll ask the final question: is peace in the South China Sea still possible? Chapter 5. Is peace in the South China Sea still possible? For all the patrols, court cases, and island building, the region hasn't erupted into war. Not yet, but it hasn't found peace either. The South China Sea sits in a kind of tension, quiet on the surface, but volatile beneath. So the question is no longer just, who owns what? It's, can this region avoid open conflict and build something more stable in its place? Let's begin with the obvious. The US-China rivalry is escalating. China sees the South China Sea as its blue national soil. The US sees it as an open, international waterway vital to global commerce. Roughly $3.5 trillion worth of trade passes through these waters each year. That's nearly 1/3 of global shipping. Control here isn't just about islands or oil, it's about access, influence, and security. If China were to control the South China Sea outright, it could pressure, rival, claimants, disrupt trade during a crisis, establish strategic dominance over the first island chain. That's why US policy is likely to remain engaged through military presence, security partnerships, and freedom of navigation operations. But the more frequent these patrols become, the more chance there is for an accident. And accidents here carry global consequences. The next pressure point is about world resources. Beneath the seabed of the South China Sea lie undiscovered reserves of oil and natural gas. Estimates vary, but some projections place it at over 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. That makes it the second most energy-rich maritime zone in the world after the Persian Gulf. As energy demand rises, especially among ASEAN countries, the pressure to drill, extract, and claim will only increase. Joint development could be an answer. In theory, nations could share resources, cooperating instead of competing, but history shows us that's easier said than done. Moving on, we have to consider climate change. Sea level rise threatens to submerge many of the smallest features entirely. Ironically, the artificial islands built on them may be the only things that remain visible, transforming disputed reefs into permanent land. But climate change also threatens coastal infrastructure, displaces populations, and reshapes fisheries. In an already overfished and contested region, fishing conflicts are expected to rise sharply. In the past decade alone, clashes between Vietnamese, Filipino, Chinese, and Indonesian vessels have become regular, often violent. As livelihoods are squeezed, desperation fuels confrontation. Despite all the tension in the region, alliances are shifting. Countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia don't want war, but they don't want to be pushed aside either. Some are strengthening military ties with Japan, Australia, and India through the Quad Alliance. Others are welcoming new US basing access, like the recent agreements in the Philippines allowing US troops on northern Luzon, just over 300 kilometers from Taiwan. Meanwhile, China continues to offer economic incentives such as train and road projects, port development, and other infrastructural investments. The question is no longer who will choose sides, but how long countries can avoid being forced to. So, is peace still possible? Yes, but it will take more than diplomacy alone. It requires clarity. Legal, territorial, and operational definitions must be agreed. Restraint, limiting militarization and harassment at sea. Multilateralism, not just China and the US, but ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, and others at the table. Mutual interest, trade, fishing, climate security. None of these are zero-sum. Some hope rests on ASEAN and China finalizing a code of conduct, a long-promised agreement to manage tensions and avoid conflict. But talks have dragged on since 2002. Progress is slow, and enforcement is uncertain. So where does that leave us? The South China Sea will remain a place of overlapping maps, incomplete laws, and rising stakes, a place where history was never settled, so the future stays fragile. But the future is not yet written. It may not be a flashpoint. It could be a proving ground for peaceful cooperation, or a warning of how unresolved history, if left unspoken, becomes tomorrow's instability. And that's why this sea, calm on the surface, matters to all of us. Some hope rests on ASEAN and China finalizing a code of conduct, a long-promised agreement to manage tensions and avoid conflict. But talks have dragged on since 2002. Progress is slow, and enforcement is uncertain. Thanks for watching this episode of Nowhere Specific. If there's a region or story you'd like us to dive into, drop it in the comments. We're always listening. And if you enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive from Nowhere Specific.